Hey, welcome to I keep calling these episodes, welcome to Lecture 3, which will cover the French Revolution. And just in full disclosure, this is not going to cover the French Revolution in its entirety. We're kind of hitting the highlights because we have to cover it. We can't cover it in the detail that it probably deserves, but you can do that in like a European history class or a class just about the French Revolution. And I have included on the Blackboard page a link to the Canopy streaming site, which has access to the great courses, and there is a lecture all about Napoleon invading Egypt, and there's one on the French Revolution. If you're really interested in it, look into that. Also, the podcast Revolutions takes a really, really detailed look at the French Revolution. I think in its second season, there's a link on the syllabus for that. But let's go ahead and start with a little bit of background to French society. The French population was divided into what were called the three estates. The first estate were members of the clergy, church people. They numbered about 130,000 in a total French population of 28 million, or about 0.4% of the total population. The first estate paid no taxes, but owned about 10% of the nation's land and extracted wealth in the form of tithes and fees. The second estate consisted of nobles. This is the French aristocracy, people who held high administrative, judicial, military, or church positions. They represent about 300,000 people, or about 1%. The third estate was everyone else. As revolutionary Abbe Sieyès would say, the third estate was, quote, everything. But what had it been in the political order? Nothing. There are three main groups to the third estate. Peasants, who make up about 80% of the population. These are farm workers who might own some property, might live decently if there's a good harvest. The second group in the third estate were the bourgeoisie. These are the burgeoning middle class. Think merchants, small manufacturers, bankers, doctors, lawyers, that sort of thing. However, even though they have some wealth, that doesn't give them any source of power. The final group is the Sans-Culottes. These are basically urban workers. They might be artisans who just don't make money like the bourgeoisie. They're dependent on their wages and will suffer when food prices rose, but their wages did not. They were called the Sans-Culottes because they did not wear long pants. The third estate owned 60% of the land and represented basically 98% of the population. And it's important to note, the third estate essentially paid all the taxes. After losing the 7 Years' War and then helping the Americans get their independence, France was deep in debt and facing a financial crisis. The third estate, especially the poor, had erupted in violent protest and rage in response to increased bread prices. King Louis XVI, based on the counsel of his advisors, decided to try a different tack for tackling the financial crisis. In 1787, King Louis XVI called an Assembly of Notables to approve a radical and comprehensive reform of economic and fiscal policy. The assembly consisted only of the first and second estates, so 1.4% of the population, and it's the part of the population that paid no taxes. The king was asking them to approve new taxes on themselves. How do you think they responded? No. That's exactly what they're going to say. Or I guess they would have said, no, because they're French. The refusal of the elite to grant needed taxes forced the king to call the Estates General, a sort of deliberative body representing all three estates. The Estates General hadn't met since 1614. Traditionally, the estates met separately. 2/3 of the estates were required to approve any action, which meant that the first and second estates could meet in secret, they could agree on something, and plot against the third estate. If you're in the third estate, you do not like this proposition. For 6 weeks, the third estate refused to conduct business until the king ordered the first and second estates to meet with them in a single body. Some nobles and members of the clergy proved to be more sympathetic than others and joined in the debate. On June 4th, 1789, the expanded Third Estate called itself the National Assembly. Within days, the king barred them from meeting in their designated chamber, so instead they met on a nearby tennis court. There, the members of the assembly took the tennis court oath, promising, quote, not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the kingdom is established, end quote. Commoners who were not involved in the National Assembly organized a militia called the National Guard. About a month later, the king fired his finance minister, the man who was behind the plan to tax the nobles and the clergy. Word got out, and the Third Estate saw a conservative takeover. When word got out that the king was massing troops to arrest representatives of the National Assembly, crowds and common people began to seize arms and mobilize a defense. On July 14th, 1789, write that one down, that's a big date, the militia stormed the Bastille, the prison that once housed Voltaire for satirically accusing an incestuous relationship in the royal family, stormed the Bastille to get its gunpowder reserves. The Marquis de Lafayette, who served in the American Revolution for no pay, grabbed the iron key to the gates. This iron key is still in existence. In fact, it is found at the estate of one George Washington, hanging in his hallway. Why is it there? Because the Marquis de Lafayette sent the key to the Bastille to the man he called the Father of Liberty, George Washington. Sure, the enslaved people of Mount Vernon had different opinions about that title. Peasant uprisings across France resulted in the destruction of documents that recorded debts. They seized common lands and sacked manor houses. But it wasn't just action. The National Assembly ratified the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Again, that's one of your documents. What kind of rights did this include? Quote, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It included the preservation of natural rights, including liberty, property, and security, consent of the governed, representative government, equitable taxation, free expression, freedom of religion, the whole idea of innocent until proven guilty, every citizen having a right to participate in foundations of law, and many others. Now, as all this is going on, the financial situation is getting worse. The anger of the working women of Paris, struggling to feed their families in the face of high food prices, decided to get involved in the protests. On October 5th, 1789, thousands of women marched the 12 miles to Versailles and forced their way into the National Assembly to demand action. The crowd then entered the royal apartments, killed some of the king's guards, and went on a search for the queen, Marie Antoinette. You might have heard the quote, "Let them eat cake." Marie Antoinette is alleged to have said this. She never did. But the reason for this myth-making is because the Third Estate looked at this foreign queen, she was from Austria, as the symbol of royal extravagance. Pamphlets circulated around Paris that accused her of an incestuous relationship with her son, with having an undue foreign influence, almost like a Trojan horse. In fact, outright nasty pamphlets basically blamed her for the financial crisis. The Women's March essentially forced the royal family to move out of the Palace of Versailles and into the royal palace at Paris. Now, it's not as nice as it might sound. Being in the royal palace, they're basically under house arrest and under 24-hour surveillance. For the next couple of years, France existed as a forced constitutional monarchy. A constitutional monarchy is where there is a monarchy, like a king or a queen, or both, but they really don't have power. So think of like the Queen of England is a constitutional monarch. She's a figurehead. The National Assembly passed a new constitution that limited the king's power and abolished the nobility as a hereditary class. They renamed themselves the Legislative Assembly, created a new currency, and mandated that priests be placed on a public payroll. While that's going on, Austria and Prussia threatened to intervene in the struggle to support King Louis XVI. Remember, Marie Antoinette, she's born an Austrian. Now, there were two duties she had. One was to keep a dynastic union and to have a kid to preserve the royal lineage. In a sense, by being a dutiful wife, she was also helping Austria. The Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria in 1792. The war didn't start out well. As foreign armies invaded France and the king and queen tried to escape from their house arrest, the revolution took an even more violent turn. The Legislative Assembly suspended the king's authority and ordered his imprisonment. In fact, he was put on trial for treason and sentenced to death. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was guillotined. In many ways, this inaugurated the Reign of Terror that followed. One man had to witness his granddaughter and her husband executed before he himself was guillotined, and his wife had to witness all of them executed. Competing factions of revolutionaries used rumors of counter-revolutionary plots to justify the use of violence. Overall, about 40,000 people were executed or died in prison. Now let's take a step back for a second. There's a guy here named Maximilien Robespierre. Maybe you've heard of him. Maybe you've read the document. And I know it's kind of a tough document to get through. Robespierre basically tries to justify the use of violence in the revolution. He basically says that violence is virtuous. He says, quote, "We must smother the internal and external enemies of the Republic or perish with them. Lead the people by reason and the people's enemies by terror." Guess what happened to Robespierre? He himself fell victim to the terror and was guillotined in July 1794. With the death of the radicals, the National Convention started to undo some of the more radical reforms and removed price controls that had protected the working class. Violence became less popular, and the convention responded to protests by sending out military force. They also ratified a more conservative constitution that protected property rights, established a stricter form of voting to limit the power of the masses, and created a new executive called the Directory. When the Directory lost re-election in 1797, power became a matter of force. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte, the brilliant young general who doesn't prepare for invasions of Russia, seized power in a move of popular authoritarianism. He literally crowned himself emperor in 1804. But we're going to get a little bit ahead of ourselves if we don't put a pin on this for now and move to the Haitian Revolution.